Konferencja Impact' w Poznaniu, studio Rzeczpospolitej. Witam Państwa Marcin Piasecki, ze mną gość specjalny, pan Adam Tooze, brytyjski historyk, badacz historii współczesnej, również geopolityki. Thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here.
How many crises do we have in the world right now?
It's easy to lose count, and it depends very much on what you think of as a crisis. I mean, you could say that, for instance, the humanities in the universities face a crisis as a result of ChatGPT, right? So there's a really quite fundamental existential questioning going on of what we do and what we're going to be doing in the future. But I mean, the geopolitical crisis is the obvious one, which again has different aspects. You could think of the fundamental instability in global financial systems, which manifests itself in a rather alarming range of American banks on a regular basis. You could think of, in the United States, constitutional issues which go to the heart of government, the question of whether or not America will honor its debts. This could flare up. You could then think of the environmental problem quite fundamentally, I think. Not just climate, but climate has become the cipher through which we view that. And I think if you add those four together, that's what adds up to what some of us have come to describe as a polycrisis, because each one of those things is separate from the other. They don't reduce to each other, and they compound each other in ways which then makes the whole even worse than the sum of the parts. And, you know, we saw this with the pandemic, for instance, was, to my mind, an environmental crisis properly classified as such. It's a zoonotic mutation as a result of massive disruption of the Chinese ecosystems. And it turned into a crisis that rippled across the entire world and paralyzed the economy in a way we've never seen before. So I would start with those four, and then we can multiply out. People who are in the tech world would add, I think, the disruption of AI.
And what about COVID?
Well, COVID for me is within the big bracket of the environmental shocks. I think what it made us clear of is that when we think of environmentalism, we need, if you think in terms of military history, we need the chronology both of a Cold War, which is the climate crisis, it goes on for decades, is very fundamentally rooted, but also Blitzkrieg, which is the COVID crisis. If you fail to make the right decisions in a matter of days, you lose the war. And so both of those sort of dynamics, both of those temporalities are at work within the broader ecological crisis.
And in your text, you point to the end of the neoliberalism. Is it really?
Well, I think this is a hugely complex question, which again is best thought of in breaking it down. In terms of ideology, emphatically, I mean, we had Jake Sullivan, who turns out, even as National Security Advisor, itself a significant fact, to be the lead speaker on economic policy for the Biden administration, saying in so many words that the era of neoliberalism is over, we need a new Washington consensus. What that amounts to is very large-scale American government subsidy for big business, who you might think of as being the winners of neoliberalism, so plus ça change, nothing's changed at all. If you think of neoliberalism as a structure of society, as a structure of inequality and power, then I think there is indeed a story of persistence here, but the tools that are being used to run the economy have quite fundamentally shifted. Fundamentally shifted in sort of their ideological gloss. In practice, it's an awful lot of indirect mechanisms. We're not talking about nationalization. Any conservative who starts going on about the threat of socialism returning is misleading you. This is a demagogic kind of speech. At another level, however, I think we can also talk about really quite a fundamental shift, which is that neoliberalism was not just an ideology, it was not just a practice of power, it was not just a social structure, it was also, after all, America's ideology. It was the Washington consensus. And as we know, the balance of global power has quite fundamentally shifted, and you could argue that it's that rupture which is essentially what is shaking all the other pieces loose. When Jake Sullivan says, we need to do industrial policy now in a way that we never could previously do, so neoliberalism is over, he could also be saying America finds itself challenged by China as it never has before, and so now we need to move into this new gear. At that level, I think something quite fundamental has changed. You see this in the IMF, in the World Bank. Their operating ideologies are very different from what they were in the era since, for instance, of Poland's transition in the early 90s.
But what will replace liberalism? Populism?
Well, I mean, what the Americans hope, who are actively advocating for this, is a new form of more democratic economic policy, right, that is focused on the interests of the middle class. I think it would be fair to see that as a response to populism, the challenge of populism, which in a sense was doing, I'm not one of those centrist liberals who uses populism as a term of approbation and as a term of for dismissing and criticizing my enemies, because I think it's organic to democratic politics, right? It's a democratic politics which does that dangerous thing of saying we speak for the people. And it was, beyond time for centrist liberals to come up with an answer to that. And that is, I think, what they're trying to innovate. So we don't really know yet. We don't have a good buzzword for it. But I think they would just think of it as a revived progressive democracy, not social democracy, which was the model that came out of the 20th century. And
progressive democracy. What does this mean?
Well, I think they would see it above all as a democracy that was inclusive. So there's an element here of new attention to the manifold areas of discrimination that are so powerful in American society. Racism is not just a fantasy of woke ideology in the United States. It's a lived reality. If you live in the society, it's present and in your face all the time. So it's a politics which takes account of that. It's a politics, however, also which focuses on the interests of the majority of the population, understood in economic terms. So it is a revival of that social democratic agenda, but without the historical baggage, without the historical tradition, some would say, or legacy of social democracy. This is a moment in which in the United States, organized labor has come back to the fore, not yet with big legislative breakthroughs. There was some hope for that early on in the Biden administration. All of that died because Congress will only allow quite very small moves. But in terms of the openness, the consideration granted to American labor, for instance, on the climate issue, America is oddly further advanced than Europe, which you might certainly, if you come from the Western European side, you imagine Europe to be this fairyland of trade union organization. In America, the trade unions have a more powerful voice in climate policy than they do in Europe. And ironically, it was European businesses, European car firms in particular, that lobbied quite hard against more inclusive measures for the American trade union movement, because Europe's car firms chose to build their plants in states which are non-union in the United States. So there is a kind of bitter irony there.
Okay, and in Poland there is a lot of talk about the crisis of the West.
Yes.
Real fiction. Is the West in crisis for you?
I think the rest, to my mind, crisis is a thing the West does. It's part of our identity. I would always be quite suspicious of any Western identity that thought of itself solidly founded, because I'm not a conservative. If you're a Western conservative, you presumably imagine that, a non-crisis ridden Western identity is founded, I don't know, in the legacies of the Christian church or something like that. And so that's where you found yourself, and then you imagine that to be shaken and in crisis. That's... I think it's inherent to Westernness that I would disagree with that, and then we Westerners would have to argue with each other about what's going on. I don't, by itself, see this as an issue. Certainly, I think Europe, the United States are laboratories for explorations of different types of identity, different types of politics. Some of it I personally also find ridiculous, but you've got to, as it were, appreciate the innovative and creativity of that, and that presumably is what we actually cherish as the West. If there is going to be a Western heritage, I would sign up to it. It'd be something like the Renaissance, right? It would be the incredible ambiguity, also sexual and in terms of gender, of a figure like a Michelangelo. That, if you're going to have a Western tradition, that's the one I would like to sign up to.
And let's talk about Poland.
Yes.
What is a place for Poland in those whole processes which you described?
It's really quite pivotal, actually. It's really a remarkable development of recent years, how significant Poland has become within the EU framework, which I think is the framework within which matters. Poland matters within NATO and the EU critically, right? And from the big picture, I'm speaking from 30,000 feet from Washington. Poland matters per se. It's one of the great centres of European history, but it's acquired this leverage through these bigger organisations. And that's in part because it's the great success story of the economic transition, right? The Baltic states have done very well as well, but Poland is the large player that has seen this spectacular economic and social transformation. And of course, in the new consolidation of NATO faced with the Russian threat, Poland is also the most active player. And unlike the Brits, it has stayed in the EU, is playing the game, and that's precisely what Washington likes. And so what already emerged on the Donald Rumsfeld horizon of the early 2000s, the new old Europe, you'll remember this, 2003-4 over Iraq, is back with a vengeance right now. In Poland, I think, whether we're talking about the Trump era or now under Biden as well, Poland is a pivotal player. And Poland's politics in some ways resembles America's, right? There's an element to it which is familiar to Americans, and that's not necessarily a bad thing for Europe. to have an element of a sort of slightly more American politics inside the EU.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for interview.
You're welcome.
Moim gościem był wybitny brytyjski historyk, pan Adam Tooze.